On behalf of Lexington Historical Society, I would like to thank all of you for joining us for our final program of Patriots Day week. We have been going since Thursday of last week, and so I'm glad you've stuck around with us. Our final program is a brand new presentation, which has not been seen before, and it is presented by Doug Scott and Joel Bohy. They are historians and archaeologists who have been studying the tales of the Lexington militia, among many other things. Joel is a historic arms and weapons expert and appraiser for several different auction houses. You may have also seen his face on Antiques Roadshow, as well as in many of the local reenactments in and around Massachusetts. And Dr. Scott specializes in 19th century battlefield archaeology and is most noted for his work on mapping out the Battle of Little Bighorn in the 1980s. So for any of you who saw our social media post, a picture of both Joel and Doug on that battlefield. Thanks for sharing that with us, Joel. So tonight, our lovely guests are going to be sharing with us some of the work that they've done on a particular Lexington militiaman named John Robbins, who was grievously injured during the Battle of Lexington and suffered wounds that plagued him for the rest of his life. This is something that we don't often think about. When we think about the Battle of Lexington, there are certain folks who died, and then we consider that everyone sort of packed up and continued on with their lives. But in reality, there were many people that were injured that day who suffered lasting consequences. And so right before we hit play here, we were talking about how this is such a humanizing aspect to the Battle of Lexington. Even though this is something that happened 250 years ago, these were real people who suffered real consequences to the battle. All right, so we are going to get started in just a moment. I'm going to share my screen. And while I'm doing that, I'd just like to do a couple quick reminders for anyone who hasn't done a Zoom presentation in a while. If you are using a computer, down at the bottom of your screen, you will see a number of different options of things to click on, including a Q&A button. That is the perfect place to put any questions that you may have for our speakers this evening. If you would like to have any side conversations with each other, there is also a chat function. And I see that Bill is already using that. Nice to hear from you tonight. So at any point during our presentation, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to stick something down in the Q&A box, and I'll be reading that back to our speakers at the end of the presentation. If you're using a mobile device or an iPad or anything like that, it might also be at the top of your screen. And if you're having any technical questions or anything else like that, also feel free to put that in the chat and I'll help you as best I can. So without further ado, I am going to open up our PowerPoint and get things started.
Today, Doug Scott and I are going to talk about John Robbins, a member of Captain John Parker's militia company, who was wounded on Lexington Green on the morning of April 19th, 1775. Many of us have seen the names of those wounded before, reading books or period newspapers, and but we've never really understood how badly they were wounded and how it affected their lives. Starting at the bottom, Mr. Nathaniel Cleves of Beverly, we know he had his finger shot off and he lost his horse, blanket, saddle, and bridle. Mr. Nathan Putnam was shot in the right arm near the shoulder, badly wounded. Some of the others we don't know too much about yet. Mr. Daniel Hemingway of Framingham, there's a great account of him having the ball gouged out of his chest. It was flattened like it had been hit by a hammer. Nathaniel Farmer, John Tidd, we know he lost his cartridge box. And sometimes it's hard to find the documents on these guys. But one that we have managed to find a lot on is John Robbins. So what do we know about John Robbins? Purportedly, he was born August 3rd, 1738. One site says Charlestown, although another says Lexington. He may have died in 1791 in Lexington, according to a family tree on Ancestry.com, but we don't know. We do know he married Sarah Prentice. Of Cambridge, May 14th, 1761. He was 37 years old on April 19th, 1775. When he was wounded, he had 5 children under the age of 13, his oldest being Sarah, 13 at the time. Next, Elizabeth, 1765, she was born. She was 10. John, 1769, was 6. Anna, born March 27, 1772, was 3. Ruth was born July 9th, 1774, and she was 1. And then in 1778, he had another baby named Hannah. So one of the earliest documents that I've been able to find related to John Robbins is a document that was turned into the province by the town of Lexington. In 1758, there was a law that had come out that all of the militia had to have half of their members of their company with a bayonet. So all of the towns turned in returns of who received the bayonets and how many, and in this case Lexington received 50, one of them being for John Robbins. So we know that he definitely had a bayonet when he was in service. So on April 24th, 1775, a few days after the events of April 19th, depositions were taken of those who were wounded or were there on April 19th and witnessed what happened. And one of those belonged to John Robbins. To make it a little bit easier to read, Lexington, April 24th, 1775. I, John Robbins, being of lawful age, do testify and say that on the 19th instant, the company under the command of Captain John Parker, being drawn up sometime before sunrise on the green or common, and I being in the front rank, there suddenly appeared a number of the king's troops, about 1,000 as I thought, at the distance of about 60 or 70 yards from us, huzzaing, and on a quick pace toward us, with 3 officers in their front on horseback and on full gallop towards us, the foremost of which cried, "Throw down your arms, ye villains, ye rebels." Upon which said company dispersing, the foremost of the 3 officers ordered their men, saying, "Fire, by God, fire," at which moment we received a very heavy and close fire from them, at which instant, being wounded, I fell. Several of our men were shot dead by one. Captain Parker's men, I believe, had not then fired a gun, and further the deponent saith not. So after the events of April 19th in Bunker Hill, there were some resolves put in place to help those who had lost arms, equipment, or were wounded. And these are one of the ways that we can find out a lot more about these people, because in order for them to receive payment, they had to put in letters from their captains or colonels, and if they were wounded, doctors. So these give us some really great information onto what happened to these folks. So searching through numerous volumes at the Massachusetts Archives collection, and then organizing the documents that I found, the first petition from John Robbins was June 14th, 1776, and it states, "The petition of John Robbins of Lexington humbly showeth that your petitioner was on the memorable 19th of April, 1775, most grievously wounded by the British troops in Lexington, by a musket ball which passed by the left of the spine between his shoulders, through the length of his neck, making its way through and most miserably shattering his under jawbone, by which unhappy wound your petitioner is so much hurted in the muscles of his shoulder that his right arm is rendered almost useless to him in his business, and by the fracture of his under jaw the power of mastication is totally destroyed, and by his low slop diet, weakness, total loss of his right arm, and the running of his wound, his situation is rendered truly pitiable, being unable to contribute anything to the support of a wife and 5 small children, but is rather a burden upon them, and has no encouragement from his surgeon of his being materially better. He therefore is under a disagreeable necessity of begging relief and assistance of this honorable court by a pension or otherwise as your honor's great wisdom and compassions may suggest." So from this we can see he states he was shot in the left shoulder, and it went through the length of his neck and destroyed his lower jaw. So after the committee received John Robbins' petition, they decided to give him a pension. The committee on the petition of John Robbins have heard the petitioner examined his wounds, considered his deplorable circumstances, and report by way of resolve. and the House of Representatives, November 4th, 1776, resolved that they be allowed and paid out of the public treasury to and for the use of the petitioner John Robbins the sum of 13 pounds 6 shillings and 8 pence yearly until the general court shall otherwise order it, to recompense him for his sufferings by wounds which he received on the 19th of April 1775. So every year he would have to put in for his pension in order to receive the funds. So as I mentioned, none of these documents are all in the same place. They're scattered throughout volumes in the archives. And going through various payments, I found this document from 1777, June 19th. You are hereby directed to pay out of the public treasury of this state to Deacon Jonas Stone. Jonas Stone was from Lexington, for the use of John Robbins of Lexington, a pensioner, the sum of 13 pounds 6 shillings 8 pence in full for 1 year's pension to 19th of April 1777. In John Robbins' 1778 petition to the state, now we see an additional document, which is from his doctor, Marshall Spring, who was from Watertown, to the Honorable Council of the State of Massachusetts Bay. This certificate humbly showeth that the bearer, Mr. John Robbins of Lexington, received such a grievous wound through the muscles of his right shoulder, neck, and jawbone, which last has miserably fractured, by which wound the unhappy man is yet so debilitated in his right shoulder that he is unable to perform but very little labor, as fatigue upon his small farm for the support of a numerous family of young children, and in the opinion of the subscriber, who was his surgeon, he is unhappily like to remain in such a weakened and hopeless condition during life, and is a proper object of the gracious bounty of the state. July 5th, 1778, signed by Marshall Spring, and it also states he was wounded on the morning of April 19th at Lexington. By 1779, John Robbins still hadn't completely recovered yet, and he put in another petition. This one's changed up a little bit from the 1776 petition. The humble petition of John Robbins of Lexington begs leave to show the Honorable Council and House of Representatives, the State of Massachusetts Bay, that your petitioner has been a subject of your Honor's kind bounty since the memorable 19th of April, 75, in consequence of a grievous wound then received from the British King's troops, by which he is almost unable to perform the slightest manual labor, contribute to the maintenance of a wife and 6 small children. Your petitioner is still under the disagreeable necessity of accepting such further grant as your Honor's great wisdom and humanity may suggest, either by your commissary for rations or such a sum of money as will afford him a bare subsistence, which your Honor's last grant would be no means procure, in consequence of a depreciation which your Honors by no means imagined or conceived of, which consequently threw your petitioner heavily upon the benevolence of his friends, and has obliged your unfortunate petitioner to trouble your Honors with this distressing representation, and humbly beseeches your Honors to afford him certain relief and assistance as your Honors' known humanity and justice may dictate. And your petitioner, as in duty bound, shall ever pray. Lexington, June 20th, 1779. In John Robbins' 1780 petition, he goes back to the same wording that he used in 1776, where he describes his wound going through the left of his spine between his shoulders through the length of his neck, basically describing the horror of the wound that he received on April 19th. So at the end of the Revolution in 1783, there were many men who were wounded during the war from 1775 through the end who still were in need of assistance. And there was a new resolve that came out. This is the original resolve from Massachusetts Archives collection, and it was published in the newspaper on July 10th, 1783. And it states, ordered that all those persons in this Commonwealth who have been wounded at any period during the late war and who are entitled to a pension from government, as a compensation therefore by any resolve of the General Court, be directed to report themselves and make known their circumstances to the several persons herein after mentioned in their respective counties. So John Robbins would have had to report to Benjamin Brown of Lexington, and he would have had to have shown his wounds and that he was still disabled. On December 26, 1786, a new resolve came out from the General Court. And it stated, in pursuance of a resolve of the General Court passed July 8, 1786, Commissary of Pensions of this Commonwealth has lodged in the Secretary's office a list of persons born on the pension list who in his opinion are able to do garrison duty. Their names are as follows, and the second one down is John Robbins of Lexington. And at the bottom of the list, they are hereby called on to appear at the office of John Lucas, Commissary of Pensions, on Wednesday, the 10th day of January next at 11 o'clock. So they had to be checked out by John Lucas. And as mentioned before, John Lucas was to go over each soldier's pension records and meet with them, and his book survives with all of his notes on the wounds of the soldiers who came to him, including John Robbins. And this certifies that John Robbins, soldier and inhabitant of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, who belonged to the Massachusetts Regiment of Militia commanded by Colonel Thomas Brattle, and in John Parker's company in the service of the United States of America, age 48, as appears by certificates lodged in the pension office, having been examined by me, is found to be disabled in said service by a musket ball in his right shoulder and his right cheek. And I do hereby certify that he is entitled to receive 20 shillings per month, commencing 17 March 1786, agreeably to the resolution of Congress of the 7th of June 1785, and to an act of the legislature of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts of the 17th of March 1786, that said Robbins is now fit for guard or garrison duty, given under my hand at Boston this 24th day of July in the year of our Lord 1786, and in the 11th year of our independence of the United States of America, John Lucas, Commissary of Pensions. So this helps answer another question. John Robbins mentions being hit in the left shoulder, to the left of his spine, going up through his neck and coming out of his mouth, destroying his lower jaw. Now we have Marshall Spring's document, which mentions it went in to the right of his spine. And then again, now we have John Lucas, who also mentions the same thing, that it actually went in to the right of his spine and up through his neck and out his mouth. So after the John Lucas pension list book, there's nothing else that I've been able to find on John Robbins or his wife Sarah. As mentioned at the beginning, he possibly died in Lexington in 1791. There's no record of when his wife Sarah died, and I've searched for both of any probate records from either of them. Their daughter Sarah dies in 1837, and the probate mentions she lives in the Scotland area of Lexington, which is over by East Lexington, Monroe Tavern area. And there's no burial records for John or his wife Sarah that survive in Lexington in their town records. So at this point, hopefully some other folks and maybe ourselves, Doug and I, will find some more information on them. One of the great things about doing presentations like this is you can always add to it as things are found. But now we're going to move on to some musket and ballistics data from Doug Scott.
Here you see the British pattern 1769 short land musket. This was the type the light infantry carried at Lexington on April 19, 1775. It's nearly 5 feet long, just short a couple of inches, with the actual barrel of being 42 inches long, and the bore diameter is 0.78 inch in diameter. That's just a little over 3/4 of an inch. This was very typical for firearms used by the British in the Revolutionary War. The British muskets, the majority of them, fired a lead round ball that were about 14 to the pound, or about 0.69 caliber, just under 0.7 inches in diameter. So it's a fairly hefty ball. It weighs about an ounce. It was propelled by around 110 grains of gunpowder, black gunpowder, and could achieve velocities anywhere from 800 to 1,200 feet per second. This is very typical, and you'll notice that they say 14 to the pound. or 29 and 2 pounds of service, which allowed for some variation because this was produced by cottage industry, and not all things were cast, and the quality control, the molds and so forth was limited to a certain degree. But in all, the balls were around 0.69 inch in diameter or 69 caliber. Part of our study has been to actually analyze balls found from archaeological sites around the U.S. and particularly from the American Revolution and other related sites. What we found that the balls range in actual diameter from 0.67 to 0.71 inch in diameter, with an average of 0.68, which falls within the range of variation of the 14 balls to the pound that the British regulations called for. They're just a little bit average-wise under by a hundredth of an inch under diameter, although some could be over, and that's why the large caliber of the British musket allowed for some variation in that. We found some dropped and measured some dropped and unfired British balls from a fort site in the Caribbean, from Fort Ticonderoga and other places. And this example on the lower left is from one of the Caribbean sites, unfired, and it is about 69 caliber in diameter, 60.69 inch, and weighs about 30 grams. This is pretty typical, and 30 grams is about an ounce. So, but the British musket ball, we know that dates to April 19th, 1775, was taken out of the rafter in the Merritt and Nathan Monroe house in 1915, and that's, you see the ball there, which is now at the Lexington Historical Society, and you can see where it struck the wood. There's some wood still adhering to it. You also notice that the impressions of the wood grain in the ball itself from where it struck at high velocity, and that divot up at the top is from somebody using a knife to dig it out of the rafter in 1915. The bullet is 70 caliber, so it's a little oversized, and it weighs 31 grams, which again, just about an ounce or a bit more, which is typical, and it was in the range of variation that we see in our musket ball study. So this is the kind of ball, and generally speaking, the kind of impact that balls receive when they struck an object. Another part of our study goes beyond looking at the actual physical evidence of the bullets and the firearms used and doing live fire testing. It's experimental archaeology. We can replicate what happens when objects are struck by a ball at high or medium or low velocity and see what's really done. And here we're using a 1756 Longland musket to fire into ballistic gelatin. And that will help us understand what that bullet could do and might have done to somebody like John Robbins. Here you have an image of a 69 caliber ball about to enter some tissue simulant, or ballistic gelatin as it's also called. And this is part of our live fire study, which we did with using high-speed videography. And on the what you can see is a 69 caliber ball just about to enter the tissue simulant. It's going to pass through, and there's a video here in just a moment, pass through some cloth, which simulates a jacket, a waistcoat, and a shirt that could have been worn by a person of the era. And the ball is going to pass through that clothing, then about 24 inches of tissue simulant, which if two people were standing back to front, that would be equivalent of around two people. The ball is going to pass out of the side of the block, and then it will fall to the ground about 100 yards away. We recovered these bullets during our live fire study so we could actually look at the individual damage that occurred to the bullets, and we were able to record the velocity and all that. What I particularly would like you to note as you see the video is the wound cavitation, or what's happening in that tissue, and the cloth fragments in the wound track. Keep an eye on that ball as it moves through. You'll see early on that the cloth is in front of the ball, but as it loses kinetic energy and speed, then the cloth will actually slip around and be on the back side of that ball, and fragments will be left in the wound track. So let's look at the video. Here's the ball passing into the cloth, and you'll see the large cavity that's occurring. Now that will become smaller after the wound cavitation closes. There's the ball going forward. You can see the bits of cloth if you look closely. It is now behind the ball, and the ball is exiting the gelatin and going down range. And there you can see the cloth behind the bullet as it flies off screen. Note that wound cavitation. Now that will retract because tissue and muscle are very resilient because there's a lot of water in it, and it will come back into become a small wound track like you can see in the upper block or the lower block. Where previous shots have gone through it. And in that lower block, you can actually see bits of fabric still in the wound track. But that is the kind of effect that would have had on John Robbins when this bullet passed through his body, going in on the right side of his shoulder and coming out at his jaw. It's massive dislocation of tissue and possibly and obviously bone when it hit his jaw. It's lucky that it did not strike his spine and paralyze him, but it did significant damage as we well know. So, but this is a very strong visual of what the effect of a bullet passing through a person would be like. Here's the recovered bullet that you just saw pass through that tissue simulant. And here you can see the actual fine impressions of the weave of the cloth. And of course the cloth it's laying on is the cloth that it passed through. So you're seeing what would happen, the kind of hole that would be left, but also the kind of evidence that is left on the bullet. And in this case, there's not much deformation because it didn't strike bone or any hard tissue. Here you see the cloth that we've recovered from the wound track and also downrange from where the ball exited the tissue simulant. And you can see that these bits and pieces, after we clean them up, would have been in that wound track. And the surgeon's report and the petitions by Robbins himself talk about the continuous weeping or suppuration of the wound, which means that it was still infected, and it was trying to get rid of this foreign material that was in the wound track. So it was something that he lived with for a good part of his life, not to mention the breakage of his lower jaw, which caused him other problems. But this material, this is the kind of thing that happened, and it led to a lot of infections, and in many cases death to people, although Robbins must have had a pretty healthy constitution to be able to survive with some of this kind of material probably still in the wound track. The bullets you see here, the ones on the left, are unfired, and the others are fired, and they've hit various kinds of media, hard media and soft media. So the bullet on the top right and the lower right may look a little like probably the bullets that would have been deformed that passed through John Robbins' not only tissue but his jaw, probably something like the one on the top right, where it's expanded and flattened a little bit because the bone is hard tissue that can cause some of that damage. But it gives you an idea of what what a bullet might look like that's passed through tissue and struck various kinds of soft and hard media, tissue and bone, for all practical purposes. John Robbins' petition state the ball passed on the left side of his spine between his shoulders and length of his neck, making it through most miserably shattering his upper jawbone. Other petitions, later petitions, as well as the surgeon's reports, say it was on his right shoulder and passing up and through his neck and on the right side, which makes more sense probably. If Robbins had been ordered to disperse and turned as he said he did, but if he was standing upright, the ball would have hit near the spine on the right shoulder, but could not have passed upward. That ball would have gone in, and if it passed throughout his chest, it just could not have done that way if he was standing upright. So it's far more likely that Robbins was actually had turned, and he may have heard the regulars fire. He may have instinctively ducked or hunched over, and that's when the ball struck him in the right shoulder near the spine, passing up through his neck and out the side of his jaw. This position is far more consistent with the wound path described in his doctor's petition, and it would have made a tortuous path and caused a good deal of damage, as well as shattering his lower jaw as the ball exited. He continued to have problems, as we well know from the previous discussion of the petitions, that his wound continued to weep from infection probably, that the jaw was shattered. He was on that low slop diet, which means he was eating gruels and thin soups probably, maybe not getting adequate sustenance, as well as his arm being damaged. All of this makes perfectly reasonable sense if you talk to a pathologist that has seen these kinds of wounds before. This is exactly the kind of thing that could have happened, and he would have been incapacitated in part, certainly the nerves in the shoulder being badly damaged from the ball itself, and losing his use of his right arm as well as his jaw. He suffered in life, and the physical evidence that we can look at, as well as the experimental archaeology that we have done, is consistent with this story, and it brings to life John Robbins' story in a way that I think just a petition on paper cannot. And so it's putting the physical evidence, the historic record, the petitions, and the like together to tell a more complete story of Mr. Robbins and the effect that war had on him and his family.
So obviously, after hearing all of this and seeing the documents, we know that John Robbins didn't have a good life after April 19th, 1775. The size of that musket ball going in to the right of his spine, disabling his arm, going up through his neck and destroying his jaw, affected him terribly for the rest of his life. And his life would never be the same. And through this research, he's not just a name on a page of a book or a newspaper, but we can understand the human side a little bit more and the horrors of what he and all the others went through, and that his life was forever changed and altered on April 19th, 1775. And now we're at the end of the presentation. If anybody has more information, our emails are at the bottom of the screen. We'd love to hear from you. But we want to give thanks to the Lexington Historical Society, Stacy and Sarah, who were so nice to allow us to present this. And Dr. John Hannigan from Massachusetts State Archives has been a huge help. The John Lucas stuff I probably would not have found without his assistance. And Massachusetts State Archives have such wonderful collections. It takes time to go through, but if it's really worth taking a look at what they have. Alexander Kane, Alex is a great researcher of April 19th, and who also allowed us to put an initial blog up on this topic a year ago, and we've found some more information since then. And also Jim Hollister from Minuteman National Park, who's been a huge help with going through all of this data and helping us along the way. Anyway, thank you for watching.
So thank you very much for sticking with us. I see that people have started putting some items in the Q&A, but before we get to that, Joel, I think you said earlier that you had some more information that you'd like to share.
Yeah, so like I said earlier in the presentation, you know, one of the great things about doing it this way is you can always add to it as we find more info. And the day that I sent this to you, after I sent it off, I was going through some other Mass Archives documents, and I found an earlier payment to John Robbins from November 11th, 1775. And there's no petition that I found with it yet. There's probably one somewhere scattered through the archives, which hopefully I'll find. But he was allowed 23 pounds, 17 shillings, and 8 pence for his wound, although they deducted some out of it to pay Dr. Spring and a few other folks who had given him money. The other thing is he may have also received a little more. On October 25th, 1775, there was 100 pounds in sterling that Benjamin Franklin had received from English friends to give to the families of those who were killed and children and wounded from April 19th. And people have seen that published in books before. You won't be able to read it, but that's a printout of it. However, in 1777, May 14th, there was also a document in the general court talking about what happened with those funds. And it looks like they had given them out. James Barrett, Colonel Barrett from Concord, along with Deacon Stone, were on the committee to pay that out. And he would have probably received a small amount of money from that 100 pounds. Although this document doesn't state exactly how much they received. However, the committee chairman, John Whitcomb, supposedly submitted a list of what everybody found with receipts. So hopefully at some point I can find that and we can add a little more to the story.
That's wonderful. One thing that has been coming up more and more recently is that we're always learning new things about history, which is great. That's actually a perfect segue into our first question here, which is very specific, but I'm going to broaden it a bit. Bill is asking where you found the muster roll of those who received bayonets. I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on where you find all this information, not only in our own archives, but sort of throughout various archives in state.
Sorry, I missed the first part of that. Can you repeat that?
Sure. So Bill was curious, Bill Poole was curious where you found the muster roll of those who received bayonets. And I'm curious if you could elaborate a bit on where you find all of this amazing documentation, not only in the Historical Society, but elsewhere.
So the bayonet document, the archives, they tried to organize them in the 19th century, and they did a fairly good job. However, the stuff is scattered all over the place. And in some ways, you have to go through every volume to find certain things. So there's one volume that has a lot of the bayonet payments per town. But then in another volume, there's more. And then that particular one ended up in a muster roll volume. So you kind of have to search all over the place to find these things. And again, like the John Robbins petitions, they're not all in one place. They're scattered through, I think, 6 or 7 volumes. So you really have to dig. I mean, it took me 4 years to find all those. And that isn't just, you know, spending a minute here and there. It's a lot of time.
Great. If anyone else has any questions, again, feel free to stick them in the Q&A. I've also been keeping an eye on the chat, and I don't see anything there. I'm curious if you two could give a little bit more insight. What was it particularly, if there was anything beyond the amazing story of this wound that drew you to Mr. Robbins in particular? Have you uncovered any information about other militiamen that you're planning on?
We have. I'll answer part of that, and then Doug can answer the other part of it. but we have a lot more, and we have a lot more that we can discuss if we have the time to put it all together. But you know, I think it's twofold. The first part is learning the history of the person and what happened to him and using our study. But then I think the second part Doug mentioned, I think a few times in this presentation, and he can go ahead and talk about that, the human side.
Well, I think that what this does is, as you mentioned earlier, Sarah, is that it humanizes the story, and taking these documents, which whatever they are, the petitions, the orders for payment, descriptions of wounds, whatever they may be, it tells us that a real person, in this case John Robbins, who was much hurted, really was much hurted, and we can look at that. And one of the things that drew us to him was this left-right story, left wounding in the left shoulder or right shoulder. Perhaps he did not know which was left and right. Maybe he did, and when those, well, he was affected by the wounds to such a degree that he could say something and it might, you know, we all can be dyslexic at times, is what I guess I'm saying, which I do all the time. So I think we're learning more about the people themselves, and just we can apply the scientific method to looking at these, and that, to me, that's the fun part. But it also, we have to keep remembering that this is about the people, and there were people who survived unscathed, people who were killed, and people who were wounded at one level or another, and all of that, it brings that story to life for me in particular.
Yeah, I agree. And as someone who's been into material culture for my whole life, and sometimes I can take that to an extreme, you know, that's all well and good, you know, seeing a musket, you don't know who carried it, but, you know, it's a cool thing. But here's an opportunity to really get into that human side of the story, as opposed to it just being an object. I
agree. It's great to put some personality and a wider story to the name and a date. You had just mentioned a little bit about sort of going forward in time here. Someone actually had a question about that. Were there any provisions made for the minors and children who survived these pensioners, if you know? So there were not in the official resolves, although I believe that, you know, they tried to figure that into the amount of money that they gave overall. The only one that really mentions the children is the one that Ben Franklin had, that 100 pounds in sterling from English friends, that some of it went to the children. But you got to figure, with all those people wounded and killed, and then the children that went along with that. I mean, as we talked about, Robbins had 5 on, you know, April 19th. By the time you split that 100 pounds up, it's not a whole lot of money. You know, 14 shillings. I mean, that's one mention in there. For those who were killed, for the spouse of those who were killed, that's not a lot of money. Great. So this one might get a little bit complicated, but we'll see what we can do. For some of our locals, is there anything that you can say to John Robbins' relation to any of the other Robbinses of East Lexington? So, very popular family, especially in the early 19th century here in Lexington. Well, there are obviously other Robbins that I ran into doing some of the petition side of the research, or the Robbins side of the research. And, you know, but the thing with this type of work is I could go off on so many tangents and put so much together, but I was trying to keep it to him and his immediate family. You know, you can end up, and I do this all the time, I have a hard time focusing, and I can be looking for something in the archives, and all of a sudden I find something else, and I'm down a rabbit hole that I didn't intend to go down. So I try to keep it as focused as I possibly can, and it's a struggle for me, believe me. But you know, again, I tried to keep it strictly to him and his kids and his wife, and a little bit into, you know, the kids as they got a little bit older, as I was trying to track where he might be buried, because I really wanted to find that out. And in talking to the cemetery department in Lexington, they have no idea where he was buried. And obviously he was going to be poor, or he was poor. And, you know, they probably just
for some reason, there's no record of it. So anyway, kind of a long answer to the question, but.
But it's presentations like this that can get people interested, and hopefully somebody will come forward with more information. That'd be wonderful.
Right. You know, and that Doug's right. You know, it'd be great if somebody took the ball and ran with it, because, you know, it would be really interesting to find out some more about the family.
Definitely. Yeah, there are quite a few Robbinses around Lexington this time period.
Yeah, it's like any you know, Concord with Barretts and Hosmers, and Acton with Hosmers and Robbins, and you know, it's just some of those old town names are still there. Said by someone who grew up in Concord. So,
yeah.
You know, I grew up with Hosmers and Barretts, and.
All right, here is a question that's probably more for the American side, I would say. Can you speak a little bit more about the different types of shot that was used that day? Was anyone using buckshot? Was that wounding anyone?
Yeah, and you know, probably I like to go by documentary evidence. There are mentions of shot being in people's pouches, shot and, you know, bird shot and ball, solid, you know, larger round ball to fit their gun. I would have to say, as far as going to the material culture side, as far as the arms of April 19th, the majority of the extant arms are fowling pieces for hunting. And during the Parker's Revenge project, we did find some ball. Doug and I were both on that project. That's where I met Doug. And we found ball. We didn't find buckshot or bird shot, but we did find ball that would fit in a fowling piece. But again, through some of the petitions, the other petitions for losses, there are mention of buckshot in their pouches.
Great. Next question is, when did the science of ballistics begin? And has it ever been used to develop weapons?
The answer is yes, and a very long time. They wouldn't call it ballistics or until the late 19th century, but gun manufacturing, development of capabilities has been going on since the 1300s, at least in Europe. And it just moves forward with better and better technology and experimentation and so forth. But the current forensic ballistics, as people call it, or firearms examination, which is a more proper term, really started around 1835 in London. And it was about a guy being accused of committing murder with a particular handgun, and that a small caliber pistol, and that particular gun had a bullet mold with it, and it had a flaw in it, and they were able to show that flaw matched the flaw in a bullet taken from the body of the murdered man. So this guy was convicted and hanged, I think is a proper term. But it was all based on the flaw in the bullet. That'd be a little more circumstantial evidence today than it was in 1835. But since then, that whole concept has developed on in determining what kind of weapons fire, bullets or cartridge cases, if we get into that era. And there is a lot of things you can do with looking at striations on bullets and determining the caliber, the type of weapon, and sometimes even the specific weapon if you're lucky enough to have certain what they call individual characteristics retained on a bullet. But it's been around since essentially the early 19th century. Really developed in the early 20th century, in the 1920s, and has continued to develop today, and with just better and better technology and determining the types of firearms being used and whether a particular firearm was used or not. And we're not doing forensic investigation. We're applying forensic methods to historical questions. So that's what I would say.
That's great. Oh, Bill thinks he has found the original Robbins, Thomas Robbins, who was born in 1703. I'm looking directly over my computer at my copy of Charles Hudson's genealogy, so I'll be looking at that later. Maybe I can get you some family trees connections in a little bit, Harry. I'll see what I can do for you. All right, I'm just going to check the chat here. Does anyone else have any burning questions for our speakers before we let you go for the night? It has been quite a diverse discussion. I'm very excited for all that I've learned today, even having seen this presentation once before. Just give it a moment here. All right, well, I don't see any more hands raised. So I will say, oh, now people are coming in. Awesome. Hope we're getting some thank yous. Thank you, Garrett.
Yeah.
Oh, here's a good one. So Joel, you were involved with Parker's Revenge, correct?
Yep.
Is there anything else planned for Minuteman at the moment? Are we heading towards Bloody Angle anytime soon?
All I can say is nothing.
Okay.
So, no, it's one of those things where if there's work coming up, or there's not, it's one thing that we can't really or shouldn't discuss.
Understandable. All right, and we have one final query here. Are there similar techniques that have been used to examine wounds from subsequent conflicts, like the Civil War and World War I?
That's fairly easy to answer in one way. The Civil War has what is a 6-volume set called the Medical and Surgical History of the Civil War, which deals with diseases and wounds and lots of really gruesome imagery of wounds from the Civil War. There's another one that talks about wounds, mainly just a brief listing and discussion from the American Indian Wars of late 1860s and 70s. And then same thing in First World War and Second World War. From an archaeological perspective, we on occasion recover human remains. Usually we aren't looking for them, but sometimes they show up on battlefields. And the opportunities, depending on the descendant community's feelings about things, we've had opportunities in the past, and not just me, but many other archaeologists, to examine or through anthropology, physical anthropology and bioarchaeology, to examine some of these skeletal remains from those who were killed in action in various conflicts. And you can see evidence of wounds on many of the individuals, so that yes, that it's a field of study, and it really does depend on the feelings and belief systems of the descendant communities, particularly here in the United States. There's lots of stuff going on in Europe with World War I and even World War II, and of course our U.S. Defense POWMIA Accounting Agency, DPAA, is tasked with recovering American remains from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the current conflicts, and repatriate them to families.
Great. I see a hand up here. Harry, did you have an additional comment, or did you end up writing that in the chat?
Okay. No, I heard you say raise your hand, so I raised my hand, and then I raised the chat. So I'm not sure how to lower. Oh, I say I can lower it now.
No problem.
We're all learning.
We're all learning all the time. But thanks for your question. Glad we could get it answered. All right. Well, we have reached the hour mark. So thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. This was really enlightening. I'm always so glad, Patriots Day is something that's full of traditions that we've been doing for years and years, and to get new information about old names is always thrilling. Like you said, to put some personality and some humanity to these figures is so important, and particularly some of these names that we don't speak about as often because they did survive the battle. There were more than the 8 who were there on Lexington Green. It was definitely it was a community effort as the town came together on April 19th. So I'd like to thank you so much for bringing this information to light and for giving John Robbins a voice in all of this after all this time. So for anyone who was not able to make it to this entire performance, this has been recorded. We will make it available shortly on YouTube. And we thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to Doug, thank you to Joel, and to all of our attendees. And we hope you had a wonderful Patriots Day.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor.